So here we have the beginning of the piano trio, and of course it's beginning with the piano on the Allegro moderato. What's pretty useful to do is to have in mind where themes come in. So one of the first things that I would be thinking about here is to highlight the idea of the theme or the seed of the theme, this pattern, something that we're going to see in other places as well. So you should be listening out for this coming along. We should also identify a key. So of course we're starting off in B flat. B flat is going to be an important key for this piece. And if you look at the chords here, there's lots of this B flat, D, F. We've got the B flat major triad. So this essentially lasts for quite some time here, doesn't it? It only changes as we get to bar 4, and here we have B flat, or rather we could look here, E flat, G, and B flat. So this is an E flat triad, the 4th chord in B flat major. And we're then going to have a bit of alternation between those chords. So this sort of sets us up with an idea that it's not necessarily that tonic and dominant, the 1st and the 5th idea, but we have the subdominant having a bit of importance in its role here, alternating with the tonic chord. So I'm not necessarily going to write under every single bar what the chord is. Hopefully, if you're comfortable with identifying what the notes are, the triads should be fairly straightforward for a lot of areas, but I will pick out some areas where things go a little bit unusual or have something that's worth commenting on. So of course we've got quite a slow harmonic speed or rate of change going on here. We've got this same harmony for the first 3 bars. We're not quickly switching between these chords. But what we have towards the end of this phrase, as we go down here and the strings are entering, there's a little bit of weirdness going on here. We've got some accidentals coming up. We've got definitely here this F major chord. Now again, you might think about that in context of B flat, but for me, I'm thinking F is important here. So this would be our tonic chord in F. And then what do we have just before that? We have the G and B flat. This F almost functioning a bit like a pedal here, coming in towards the tonic chord there. And we've got the E natural. So if we have E natural, G, B flat, this is going to be the diminished 7 in F major. And I'll use the ABC notation, for the chord inversions. This is, of course, going to be a first inversion if we're counting it there as the E diminished chord. So this seems to be important. We've got this idea of switch to the F major, the dominant key here. But of course, we've got a lot going on melodically as well. So as I said, this is where the strings are entering. They are, again, making the F quite prominent, even here at the entry, not just here where we've marked that F chord. But they're bringing themselves into a bit more prominence with this crescendo here as well. So nice kind of smooth movements for the strings. They are playing it, of course, in octaves here, which is going to give it a nice sound and breaks away a little bit as the cello goes off into its own section there to take the lead. So this is a bit of a transitional section here. We're moving a little bit further along to see what's actually coming next. Again, we've got some unusual looking chords here. This could be something to take a note of. So to me, this straight away looks like a 7th chord in second inversion. We've got the C here, the E natural, the G, and the B flat. So this is something we could kind of debate as well. Are we going to put that in F? Are we going to put it back in B flat? It's still got the E natural, which gives me a sense of, is it the dominant chord in F? It definitely could be. It could be that dominant seventh in F, C, E, G, B flat. So I think we're not going immediately back to B flat here, but further along here, this could be more of that transition back to B flat. Although of course we've got this B natural in the violin part that complicates things a little bit. So this underneath does give us the F, A, C, which could be, of course, either the tonic chord of F or the dominant chord of B flat. And we've got this chord here, the A, C, E flat. But notice F's here as well. This gives me the idea that we are actually going into B flat to make that a dominant seventh in B flat. So remember, with a lot of this as well, you can justify yourself if you disagree, and you think it's a different chord, as long as it makes sense, as long as you've got an appropriate chord name for it, you're not necessarily wrong. But you've got to think about what's the function, what's kind of going on within that area. And of course, sometimes some of these chromatic notes are going to complicate the situation as well. So all the way through this section, we've kind of got a phrase and a transition. We've got the piano taking the main melody at the beginning. The cello is coming in and having a role here. The violin has some imitation of the cello's role there as well. And then we're kind of landing towards the second phrase here, where we see this restatement of that initial crotchet pattern. And of course, this time the violin has the lead. The piano has a lot more texture in it. It doesn't just have those left-hand chord patterns. It's got that in the right hand as well. And we've almost got this sort of counter melody thing going on in the cello part too. So a little bit more going on. One thing that's useful to be able to do as you're analysing different parts of scores is to think about, how do they compare to what you had before? Is it the same material presented in a different way? Is there something added to it? How does the instrumentation or texture change with that as well? So the melody range for this is actually quite narrow. We've got everything in the violin pretty much within an octave. It's not show-off high kind of pitches for the violin. This is pretty low pitch range. It's going to make a nice warm sound for the violin melody. And it's almost getting buried if you compare, for example, here with what the piano is playing. It's kind of dipping into that range. It's not up in the sky, kind of high above everything else. It's dipping into that same range and bringing that warm sound together. We do have a bit of a destabilizing influence here as well with these SFPs, the sforzo pianos. These are coming on the second beat of the bar, which is going to potentially mess with our idea of emphasis on the beginning of the bar. And that continues as well as we go, as we go further into this phrase. Not only in the strings, but also in the piano as well. So already we've got a bit of an idea of ambiguity or destabilization with that emphasis on those second beats. That does fade away a little bit at that point, and we're just going into sort of contrary motion with the strings, violin heading up, cello heading down, quite a big pitch range gap by the time we get to bar 21 here. And of course, we're heading down in dynamics as well. We've got this crescendo a little bit here, but then straight down to pianissimo in all of the instruments in this bar here. So a little bit of a drawback at that point as we then go to this next fragment with these trills. So in here as well, we've also got a bit of a pedal note going on with the cello. So here, notice this is something that continues. Pedal notes can be useful as well if you're ever not sure what key you're in, because it's often going to be the dominant note of the key. I would label this as a dominant pedal, the F, so we're still in B flat major here. This is an F pedal, and it's also reflected in the piano part. Look that we've got these repeated Fs coming through there as well. We have a bit of dissonance kind of going on in this area here. So not only have we got the G flat, the A flat and the B natural, which might be a bit dissonant there. This is kind of a seventh, isn't it? The B flat. Sorry, I keep saying the wrong notes. The B, the D, F, and A flat, that's the seventh chord, is holding on to that for a little while. And at the same time, we've got the A flats up in the violin part, and we've got this sort of trill business going on with various notes increasing, ascending there. This really is sort of a dominant. It depends if you think about those trills as a decoration or as part of the chords there as well. So because it's a seventh built on B, what I would suggest is going to be a dominant of the fourth chord, so dominant of E, E flat. But this is definitely a bit of a dissonant moment. We've got kind of increased tension coming up with this ascending trill sequence as well. And then we're just keeping on with this F, kind of holding a sense of something might happen in a moment. So does it get resolved as we turn the page? Well, not straight away. It's going to be a continued sense of dissonance. Again, here it's going to be with the F and the G flat really making that dissonance come through there. And this is definitely a weird chord. We've kind of got the E as well, the E flat as well. So E flat, G flat, B flat wouldn't be so dissonant on its own, but this F is going to mess with making a seventh and a second at the same time. So in here, we've got that dissonance, we've still got this pedal kind of coming through, and the trill fragments keeping coming. Again, this is something that we'll see a lot coming through all the way from the beginning. And we've got a little bit of a strange interval falling down here in the violin part as well. So this F flat to D is going to be an augmented sixth as an interval. A little bit of an unusual one. Sometimes exam questions and things will ask you to look for unusual intervals, so it's worth knowing roughly where they are or what kind of intervals you might need to look for. That's one example, of course, that you could use. So as we go down here, I think this is really getting into that E flat, the dominant of E flat. So I'm going to suggest that this is a more secure place to say that that modulation has happened. So this is going to be the B flat, D, F, A flat, the dominant chord of E flat. We've got a little bit of a strange thing happening here as well, a lowered fifth with the F flat. That's going to make unusual intervals within that chord as well. But we're kind of resolving into this new key, keeping up that new seventh chord for some time. until we really do get to the chord 1 here with the E flat, G, B flat. So the harmony here again goes back to being a bit more straightforward. We've got straightforward triads for a little while there. And we get this imitation coming in as well, especially as we get then to the next bar. So this is quite subtle actually. We've got this figure that kind of leaps around between the two parts of the piano, and it's going to come in up here in the strings as well. So we've got a little bit more subtle imitation. This is going to take some of those intervals from that initial theme fragment. So it sounds familiar, but it's a little bit of something new happening in there as well. So in here as well, we've got the cadence that forms the end of this first subject group. I would suggest it goes throughout these two bars. And we're ending absolutely on an F. And I'm going to put this back in B flat major here. So we've got the dominant chord, an imperfect cadence, if you will, on the end. And working backwards from that, we've got the B flat chord. Keep working backwards from there. So this is a bit of a resolving thing going on here. We've got the 1C, because of course the F is in the bass there, in the lowest voice of the chord, going up to a dominant 7th. So we're kind of switching over. This is a 6-4-5-3 progression into the cadence. And before that, we've got just a root position B flat chord. So cadences again can be quite helpful to know, because that's going to give you an idea of where different sections end, but also what's going on, what keys you're using as well. So after that, we have a bit of a textural change coming into bar 33. This very elaborated descent here, I would suggest this has triads as a basis, but we've got, of course, the little mordants and the triplets going on at the same time, making it a bit more fancy. But I would notice, what are my starting notes as I'm coming down here? This triplet versus the quavers, this is going to give you a bit of a polyrhythm feel, because you've got essentially 2 notes against 3 the whole way round, or almost 2 against 5 if you count the decoration, but the main rhythm is going to be a 2 versus 3 within the piano. Cello has the same fragment that we started with again, so this is again something to keep looking out for, because it's going to keep surfacing as we get through the piece. And the cello actually makes changes to this as it goes here, so it's going to have this type of pattern, a long held note, this same type of pattern again, but notice it's changing pitch. We've moved not the whole thing down, but the A here from the B flat, the G sharp from what was an A before, but the D is still staying the same. So it's not quite a sequence, but it's the same melodic shape with these more subtle changes being made to it each time. So it's not all notes being shifted in the same direction, but it is keeping that overall shape as it moves. One thing that is different here is that rather than going to the dominant after the first presentation of this pattern, we have the tonic here. So it's changing a little bit the emphasis on where it's landing in this section. The key is a little bit strange here. We've got a section that seems more appropriate to be in D major, we had the A here ultimately forming a D major triad. The D major triad turns itself upside down again here. We've got the D F sharp A again here, and that F sharp, it seems important here. It seems like that's going to be the thing that runs through. And actually, regardless of all these little decorations in the triplets, that's the consistent thing. You've always got that D and F sharp in the violin. You've always got D's, F sharps, A's in the lower part of the piano as well. So this is, again, sort of a transitional section. It keeps using that opening theme. We've got a bit more intensification here. Repetition is going to build that intensity. The triplets, the insistent kind of motion that's happening here, and the idea of the polyrhythm or hemiola, where we've got those triplets against the quavers and crotchets, is going to give us that increased intensity within this section. So this sort of carries on for a little while. We've got continuations of these triplets with the mordents against the quavers. The strings are maintaining that fragment of the opening theme, all the way until essentially we have the key change. We have a bit of something different happening here. So this section, I would suggest, is going to be a pivot to go towards G major. Notice we've got that G major key change here. At some point here, we could suggest that we're actually trying to make that change, especially with all those triplets. It's difficult to say exactly where we're going, but we're getting this D kind of coming up prominent. It's a pretty quick change then to the G major. So useful to kind of notate where you've got big key changes, especially if they come with a double bar line as well. It's going to keep things a bit easier to notice what's going on. So this is more of a stasis section. We've got, of course, the syncopation here with the one. Beat one is just this small crotchet that doesn't quite make a chord. And then we've got the syncopated notes held by the strings, double stop chords, keeping that sort of homophonic texture there, thicker texture because the strings are playing more than one note as well. But we've got this sort of buoyant system of triplets here as well. So this is interesting because of the intervals. We've got sevenths jumping up and then a bit of a resolution of that seventh. Similar thing each time, seventh and then resolutions. That gives it a sort of bobbing around feeling. It's a different sort of resonance, but the spacing of these chords underneath as well are going to be traditional sorts of chords. We've got a lot of the G major tonic and the D major dominant in various inversions. Traditional chords, but unusual spacing. So the triplet continues, triplet figure continues, as does the syncopation. It sort of dissolves out. We've not got a strong sense of the initial thematic material, which is why we've got this sense of stasis going on here. It's a bit of displaced emphasis because of that syncopation again. Similarly, like with the triplets, is the accent or emphasis going to fall a bit more on the seventh? It might feel like it does because that's the one that actually resolves into the third note of the triplet. So this is actually going to bring us towards the end of the first theme, or the material of the first theme. And we're going to have the second theme, of course, start to appear in here. So the second theme again messes with this sort of boundary. It's been delayed by this leap and resolution triplet, which takes on a few bars completely on its own. Little bit of expectation built up by these chromatic notes here, but we have the beginning of this theme here with these staccato notes as we fall into this new pattern. So this pattern is one to isolate. You can see it a little bit more easily in the string parts, where it's isolated out from the chords that are accompanying it. This is going to be your second theme. So traditionally, actually, there was a discussion of the first theme being masculine or triadic. Triadic is more informative as a label, and the second theme being traditionally feminine or stepwise. So notice here we've got these stepwise motion in the themes. In the first theme we had leaps around a triad, so it fits with that sort of traditional first versus second theme pattern. We're still in G major here, and again pretty traditional chord triads, so I won't say too much about the exact chords, but it's worth practicing identifying what chords you have in here, what inversions. The weird one is really here in bar 54 where we've got a sharp. Now the way that I resolved this was to say that it was going to be a sharp 4 in G major. Some people might come up with something different. It's almost a transition between chords, isn't it? If you look at this lower line on the piano, we've got the C sharp, the D. So it might be one of those things where it could be described differently. It could be a sort of passing chord rather than a real chord. Or you could label it as a sharp 4 chord in there. We've also got the major version of the chord 2 here, which makes sense as going in then to the chord 5, the dominant. So it's the dominant of the dominant, the major version of the chord 2. So we've kind of got some inverted elements as well. That original theme is inverted here, going up instead of down. That makes counterpoint then with the cello. It then has this sort of canonic feel to it where we're having different parts talking to each other, but not necessarily waiting for each other to finish. So we've got a much more polyphonic feel now, especially compared to the section before where we had that homophonic movement with a syncopation. So this moves on to quite a straightforward theme or quite a straightforward phrase where we've got this more legato movement going on. First just in the cello, then with the violin kind of joining in on that as well. Notice the octaves. Initially I made an assumption that this is not octaves for some reason, but of course it is. You've got the Ds in both parts there. So cello coming quite high up into the range there too. We've got a bit of a competition, I think, here between the subdominant and the dominant. So notice we've got bear in mind we're still in G, the D that's kind of making a pedal here could be a dominant pedal, but at the same time we've got this C that is almost competing with that. So this could go either way. You've definitely got a D chord there. Is it a D7th, a dominant 7th, and the C is part of that chord? Or is there some kind of different approach that you could take there? It's almost a dominant pedal, but with a subdominant part in it too. The dominant does continue, of course, as we go through the rest of the bar. So it could be that these are unresolved 7ths that don't really drop down to the B until this next bar here. So nice kind of interaction between the parts here as well. The piano has these semiquavers only when the strings have longer notes most of the time. And again, it's coming down the opposite way, nice and sweet on top of that main phrase. We've got more contrary motion here as well, little bits of overlap between the fragments in the piano part. This is probably quite a difficult thing to do as a pianist, to have all these thirds moving down like that. So that could be something to comment on in terms of the skill required for the piece. And we have possibly the really weird chord coming up on here. So this section here, I would say you've got the G major chord landing you at the beginning of the bar 68, but then this part here is a bit weird. So again, this might be regarded as a kind of passing chord between two other chords, as we go D, D sharp, E, and coming down in the cello part as well. So that's a weird one. Let me know if you know what to label that one. I'm gonna label it as a passing chord for now, because I think it just gets us from one place to another, whilst being pretty weird. The way possibly to stack it is to put the B at the bottom, so you've got B, D sharp, F sharp, A. That would make it a little bit more of a sensible chord, but it's a weird chord to have in the context of G major. So moving through here, we've got a bit of variation in the kind of rhythmic character. This is the seed of that same theme. Again, notice with the staccato quavers at the end of the bar, but it doesn't continue in the same way as it did before here. We've got a bit of rhythmic character variation there. Another thing that comes through a few places in this piece is that the piano introduces something that the strings then take over and put into the foreground. So the piano is kind of introducing this idea, and then later on the strings kind of steal it and bring that more into the foreground, while the piano drops back again into what it's doing there. So this kind of continues. The interesting part that we get to here is the contrary motion, and it's almost a tease of a quartet feel, that you've got the upper part of the piano and the violin kind of working together, playing in thirds, and then the lower part, the cello and the lower part of the piano, doing the same thing but in the opposite direction. So they're kind of working as four characters just for a little moment there. And that's something that comes again later as well, this idea that they're not three, there are four parts, kind of just for certain moments as you go through. So keeping along here, there's not necessarily a lot that I want to comment on towards the end of that page. But towards the beginning, we get more towards a new theme again, towards the beginning of this area. So here where we've got the ritardando, this is where we get into a link towards the third theme. The third theme itself really comes up as we get to a tempo. So this is quite triadic again. It's got that dialogue between the strings here. And the piano, of course, is just accompanying with, again, quite straightforward chords at that particular point. So it's directing more attention is going to go to what the third theme is actually doing. So this is quite a gentle close, or it's creating the expectation of coming towards a gentle close. There's a little bit of development in this theme as well as we get here. Still taking that sort of leaping figure, but presenting it in a bit of a different way. And we're going to basically continue that until we get towards the codetta. So we've got more things happening with the piano, bit of dialogue actually between the piano and the strings here. So the strings start to work more together as we get this development. And the piano is continuing with those trills whilst that's happening. And then we've got another sort of presentation, another exchange between them in the next bars. As we get to 95, this is going to be the codetta. We have potentially a little bit of a sort of C minor impression going on in the first repeat bar. It's almost going to do a fifths progression. We've got sort of a C, F, B flat in those 3 bars towards the repeat mark. It is a bit unusual actually to have a second time bar at the end of an exposition. I didn't mention before, but this of course does have that sonata form. This is going to be the exposition section. It's a bit unusual to have that second time bar at the end, but it does allow some addition here as a sort of illusion of speeding up between the triplets that are playing a pattern that does fit into 3, and then these sets of 4 semiquavers that are playing that same pattern. They're not speeding up the tempo itself, but they're playing that pattern in shorter note values. So it's not a pattern that fits into 4, it's those 3 again, and we're fitting them into semiquavers instead. So I will make a pause here. This is going to be the point where the exposition ends and we move into the development section. So the next video will then talk about the development section.